Behold the sacred fire!
It stands on a hill above Athens, visible from almost every corner of the ancient city. Even now, 2,500 years after its stones were first laid, it stops people in their tracks. Tourists crane their necks. Photographers wait hours for the perfect light. Historians weep at the sight of it. The Parthenon, the most famous building in the Western world, a symbol of democracy, a philosophy, of the birth of civilization itself. But here is a strange thing. Almost nobody knows what actually happened inside it. We know its dimensions. We know the mathematical refinements that make its columns appear perfectly straight. We know the name of the architect, Parthenon. We know the name of the sculptor, Phidias. We know it was built between 447 and 432 BC, a fever dream of marble and ambition. But when you ask people what went on inside the Parthenon, what rituals were performed, what secrets were kept, what the building was actually for, most people go blank. They assume it was a temple, a place of worship, a Greek version of a church or a cathedral, with priests and prayers and incense. That is only partly true. The Parthenon was something far stranger, far more complex, and far more controversial than a simple temple. It was a treasury. It was a political statement. It was a billboard for an empire. It was a giant bank vault that happened to contain a 40-foot-tall statue of a goddess made of ivory and gold, and the rituals that happened inside it would have looked completely alien to us today. Animal sacrifices by the hundred, processions of virgins carrying sacred objects, feasts where the smoke of burning oxen rose to the heavens. And at the heart of it all, a mystery, a chamber that only a select few were ever allowed to enter. Today, we are going to walk through those bronze doors. We are going to stand in the cool, dim interior of the Parthenon as it was in the age of Pericles. We are going to witness the rituals, meet the priests, and see the treasures. And we are going to uncover the truth about what really happened inside the most famous building on earth. 5014-0. Part 2. Before the Parthenon, the burning of the Acropolis. To understand why the Parthenon was built, you have to understand the trauma that made it necessary. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire, the greatest military power the world had ever seen, invaded Greece. King Xerxes, the great king, the king of kings, led an army so vast that, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, it drank entire rivers dry. The Persian war machine rolled over the northern defenses of Greece. City after city surrendered or was destroyed. The Persian army marched on Athens. The Athenian people, faced with annihilation, made an impossible decision. They abandoned their city. The elderly, the women, the children, were evacuated to the island of Salamis. The fighting men took to their ships. When the Persians arrived, they found Athens nearly empty. They did what conquerors do. They burned it to the ground. The temples on the Acropolis, the sacred hill that had been the religious heart of Athens for centuries, were smashed, looted, and set ablaze. The statues of the gods were toppled. The offerings of generations were carried off as plunder. The Acropolis became a charred, smoking ruin. The Persians were eventually defeated. The Athenian navy, led by the brilliant general Themistocles, crushed the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. The following year, a combined Greek army defeated the Persian land forces at the Battle of Plataea. Greece was saved, but the Acropolis remained a ruin. For 30 years, the Athenians left it that way, not because they lacked the resources to rebuild, but because they wanted to remember. The burned stones were a monument to what they had suffered. An oath was sworn, according to the ancient sources, that the temples destroyed by the Persians would never be rebuilt. They would be left as a memorial, a reminder of barbarian impiety, a spur to eternal vigilance. Everything changed. The man who changed it was Pericles. Pericles was the most powerful statesman in Athens, a man of vision, ambition, and extraordinary political skill. He looked at the ruins on the Acropolis and saw not a memorial, but an opportunity. Athens was now the undisputed leader of the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states formed to defend against Persia. The League had a treasury, funded by contributions from its members. Originally, that treasury was on the sacred island of Delos. Pericles moved it to Athens. The contributions, which were supposed to fund the common defense, became, in effect, tribute paid to the Athenian Empire. And Pericles had a plan for that money. He would rebuild the Acropolis, not as it was, better, grander, a monument to Athenian power that would make the world gasp. The greatest architects, the greatest sculptors, the greatest craftsmen of the age were summoned. Marble was quarried from Mount Pentelicus, 16 kilometers from Athens. A road was built specifically to transport the massive blocks. The project would cost an astronomical sum, equivalent to billions of dollars today. When critics accused Pericles of using lead funds to decorate Athens like a vain woman, he replied, famously, that Athens had earned the right. The Athenians had bled for Greece, they had burned for Greece. Now, the world would see what Athens could build. The Parthenon was the centerpiece of this rebuilding program. It was not just a temple, it was a declaration. Athens was not a city that had been burned. Athens was a city that had risen from the ashes, stronger and more glorious than ever before. The Parthenon was named after its patron goddess, Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, of craftsmanship, of the city itself. She was the protector of Athens, the divine embodiment of its values and its power. According to myth, she had won the patronage of the city in a contest with Poseidon, the god of the sea. Poseidon had struck the Acropolis with his trident and produced a salt spring. Athena had produced an olive tree. The Athenians, wisely, chose the olive tree. The heart of the Parthenon was not the building itself, it was what the building contained. A colossal statue of Athena, standing over 40 feet tall, made of ivory and gold. This was the chryselephantine technique, from the Greek words for gold and ivory. The flesh of the goddess, her face, her arms, her feet, were carved from polished ivory, fitted together in sections over a wooden core. Her robes, her helmet, her shield, her spear, were covered in plates of solid gold. The gold alone weighed over a ton. The statue was the work of Phidias, the greatest sculptor of classical Greece, a man whose work was said to have been touched by the gods. Phidias had already created a colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Athena Parthenos was his masterpiece. The goddess stood in a relaxed but powerful pose. Her shield rested at her side. In her right hand, she held a small statue of Nike, the goddess of victory. Her helmet was decorated with a sphinx and griffins. Her breastplate bore the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone. Around the base of the statue, Phidias carved scenes from Greek mythology. The birth of Pandora, the first woman, a cautionary tale about the dangers of curiosity and female deception. The Athena Parthenos was not just a work of art, it was a political and religious statement of staggering audacity. The gold that covered the statue was removable. It was, in effect, the treasury of Athens. In times of awe, the gold could be taken off and melted down to fund military campaigns. The statue was a bank vault disguised as a goddess. This was a radical concept. A temple was supposed to be the house of a god. The Parthenon was the house of a goddess who doubled as the state treasury. The line between religion and politics, between the sacred and the secular, was deliberately blurred. Pericles and the Athenians were telling the world that the wealth of Athens was under divine protection. To steal from the Parthenon was not just a crime, it was sacrilege. The goddess herself would punish you. The ivory and gold statue shimmered in the dim light of the interior, lit by a pool of olive oil that burned in front of it. The effect, according to ancient descriptions, was overwhelming. The goddess seemed almost alive, her ivory skin glowing, her golden robes catching the flickering light. For an Athenian citizen, entering the Parthenon and standing before this statue was a religious experience of intense power. You were in the presence of your city's divine protector. You were also, whether you realized it or not, standing in the central bank of the Athenian Empire. The Parthenon was not a single, open hall like a modern church. It was divided into distinct chambers, each with its own specific function. The main room, facing east towards the rising sun, was the cello. This was the chamber that housed the great statue of Athena. The cello was surrounded by a 2-tiered colonnade of Doric columns, which created a processional walkway around the central space. The ceiling was painted blue and studded with golden stars. The light came from the single doorway and from the oil lamps that burned perpetually before the goddess. The cello was not open to everyone. Access was restricted. Only priests and certain authorized individuals could enter. The average Athenian citizen might go their entire life without ever stepping foot inside the cello of the Parthenon. The goddess was not a public attraction. She was a mystery, a presence, a power that was too sacred for common eyes. Behind the cello, facing west, was a smaller chamber called the Opisthedomos, or sometimes referred to as the Parthenon proper, the chamber of the virgins. This room was the treasury. Here, the wealth of Athens was stored. Gold and silver vessels, offerings from kings and cities, the tribute of the Delian league. This room was a vault, guarded by the priests and priestesses of Athena. The treasures were catalogued. Inscribed stone inventories, some of which survive to this day, list the contents of the Parthenon treasury in meticulous detail. Gold crowns, silver bowls, bronze statues, jewelry, weapons captured from enemies, the accumulated wealth of an empire. all stored in the back room of a temple, under the watchful eye of a goddess made of gold and ivory. Between the cella and the opisthedomos, there may have been a third, very small chamber, the significance of which is still debated by scholars. Some believe it was used for the most secret rituals of the cult of Athena. Others believe it was simply a storage space. The Parthenon also had a basement of sorts, a space beneath the floor of the cella where the treasures of the goddess were kept. This was the true vault, a room that few people even knew existed. The treasures stored in the Parthenon were not just the property of the temple, they were the property of the goddess. To touch them without authorization was a crime punishable by death. The priests who managed the treasury were among the most powerful and respected figures in Athenian society. They were responsible for receiving donations, managing the temples well, and ensuring that the rituals were performed correctly. The line between priest and banker was, in the Parthenon, completely non-existent. The man who counted the gold was also the man who led the purse. The financial and the spiritual were one and the same. Once every 4 years, Athens erupted in celebration. The Great Panathenea was the most important religious festival in the Athenian calendar. It was a celebration of the birthday of Athena, a demonstration of civic unity, and a display of imperial power all rolled into one. The festival culminated in a grand procession that wound its way through the streets of Athens, up the steep slope of the Acropolis, and finally to the doors of the Parthenon itself. The procession was a spectacle of sound, color, and movement. Musicians played flutes and lyres, charioteers raced their horses, athletes who had competed in the Panathenaic Games marched proudly. Representatives of the different districts of Athens walked together, carrying offerings for the goddess. At the heart of the procession were the most important participants of all, the Ergistinae, the weaver maidens. These were young women from noble Athenian families, chosen for their beauty, their virtue, and their skill. For months before the festival, they had been working on the most sacred object in the entire ritual, the paplos, a large, rectangular cloth, woven with scenes from the battle of the gods and the giants, in which Athena had played a decisive role. The paplos was not just a piece of fabric. It was an offering to the goddess, a gift from the city to its divine protector. The Ergistinae carried the paplos through the streets, accompanied by the Erhephoroi, young girls who served the temple and carried mysterious sacred objects in baskets on their heads. No one outside the cult knew exactly what was in those baskets. The secrecy was part of the power. The procession made its way up the Acropolis, past the other temples and statues, until it reached the great altar outside the Parthenon. Here, the real work of the festival took place, the hecatomb, the sacrifice of 100 oxen. This was not a symbolic ritual. It was a massive, bloody, noisy, industrial-scale slaughter. The oxen, their horns gilded, were brought to the altar. Priests in white robes said the prayers. The animals' throats were cut. The blood poured out onto the altar and the ground. The meat was butchered on the spot. Portions were burned as offerings to Athena, the smoke rising in a great column that could be seen for miles. The rest of the meat was cooked in massive cauldrons and distributed to the people of Athens. The Great Panathenea was one of the few occasions when the poorest citizens of Athens got to eat meat. The festival was, among other things, a massive public feast, a redistribution of wealth disguised as a religious ritual. Inside the Parthenon, the peplos was presented to the ancient olive wood statue of Athena Polias, the city's oldest and most sacred image of the goddess. This statue, much older than the Parthenon itself, was dressed in the new peplos. The old peplos was carefully removed and stored. The cycle was complete. The goddess had been clothed by her people. The bond between Athens and its divine protector was renewed for another 4 years. The Parthenon was not just a building. It was a functioning religious institution, staffed by a hierarchy of priests, priestesses, and temple servants. The most important figure was the high priestess of Athena Polias. She was a woman from one of the oldest and most prestigious families in Athens, the Ediabautaton. She held her office for life. She was the chief custodian of the ancient olive wood statue, the most sacred object in Athens. She oversaw the rituals, managed the temple's wealth, and represented the goddess in civic ceremonies. Her authority was immense. In a society where women had few public roles, the high priestess of Athena was a figure of extraordinary power and respect. Working under her were the Erhephoroi, the young girls who lived on the Acropolis for a year of service. They were chosen from noble families, and their role was deeply mysterious. At the end of their service, during a nocturnal ritual, they carried sealed baskets down a secret stairway to a sanctuary below the Acropolis. They left whatever was in the baskets and returned carrying something else, equally secret. The ritual was never described in detail by ancient sources. It was a mystery, and the penalty for revealing its secrets was death. Also serving the temple were the male priests. who managed the finances, performed the animal sacrifices, and maintained the building. The priests of the Parthenon were not full-time religious specialists in the way a modern priest is. They were citizens, often wealthy and politically connected, who served for a term and then returned to their normal lives. Religion in ancient Athens was not a separate sphere from politics, business, and social life. It was woven into the fabric of everyday existence. The man who served as a priest of Athena one year might be a general, a politician, or a merchant the next. The Parthenon, for all its grandeur, was not a place of quiet contemplation. It was a busy, noisy, smelly, crowded hub of activity. The priests shouting prayers, the oxen bellowing as they were led to the slaughter, the scribes counting the treasure, the girls weaving the peplos, the politicians inspecting the gold plating of the statue to make sure none had been stolen, the tourists, because there were tourists even in the ancient world, aping at the colossal statue and the painted reliefs. The Parthenon was the beating heart of Athens, and it pulsed with life. The exterior of the Parthenon was as rich with meaning as the interior. The building was covered in sculpture. The meadows, square panels above the columns, depicted four great mythical battles. The battle of the gods against the giants, the battle of the Greeks against the Amazons, the battle of the Lapiths against the Centaurs, and the battle of the Greeks against the Trojans. Each of these battles represented a struggle between civilization and barbarism, between order and chaos. The Greeks, naturally, represented civilization. Their enemies represented everything that civilization must overcome. The message was clear. Athens was the champion of order, the defender of civilization against the forces of darkness. The Persians, who had burned the Acropolis, were the modern equivalent of the giants, the Amazons, the Centaurs, the Trojans. The Parthenon was a permanent reminder of the victory of the West over the East, of freedom over tyranny, of reason over savagery. This was propaganda on a monumental scale. The most famous of the Parthenon sculptures are the Elgin Marbles, now housed in the British Museum in London. These are sections of the frieze that ran around the top of the cella wall, inside the colonnade. The frieze depicted the Panathenaic procession, hundreds of figures, horsemen, charioteers, musicians, young women carrying offerings, gods and goddesses seated, waiting to receive their guests. The frieze was a mirror held up to Athenian society. The people of Athens, carved in marble, were participating in an eternal festival, frozen in time, forever young, forever beautiful, forever processing towards the goddess. The sculptures of the pediments, the triangular spaces at either end of the building, depicted the birth of Athena and her contest with Poseidon. The east pediment showed Athena springing fully grown and fully armed from the head of her father, Hellas. The other gods looked on in astonishment. The west pediment showed the contest for Athens, with Athena's olive tree and Poseidon's salt spring. The sculptures were painted in vivid colors, not the pure white marble we see today. The Parthenon was not a white ghost of a building. It was a riot of color. Blue backgrounds, red wrote, golden shields, flesh tones on the faces and bodies. The effect must have been overwhelming, a kaleidoscope of mythological orama and civic pride. The Parthenon did not remain a temple to Athena forever. The history of the building after the classical period is a story of transformation, survival, and destruction. As the Roman Empire rose, Athens became a provincial city, a university town, a tourist destination for Romans who wanted to see the famous sights. The Parthenon remained intact, its treasures still impressive, its statues still standing. Roman emperors visited, they paid their respects, they made donations. The goddess, or at least her building, was still useful. And the Roman Empire became Christian. The old gods were banned, the temples were closed or converted into churches. The Parthenon became a Christian church, dedicated first to Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, and later to the Virgin Mary. The building was modified. An apse was added at the east end. Windows were cut into the walls. The great statue of Athena was removed. What happened to it is one of the great mysteries of art history. It was probably taken to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, where it may have been destroyed in one of the many fires and riots that plagued the city. The gold was almost certainly melted down. The ivory was lost. The masterpiece of Phidias vanished from history. The Parthenon served as a Christian church for nearly 1,000 years. In 1458, the Ottoman Turks conquered Athens. The Parthenon was converted again, this time into a mosque. A minaret was added to one corner. The Christian altar was replaced with a mihrab, a niche facing Mecca. The frescoes of saints were whitewashed over. The Parthenon, which had been a pagan temple, then a Christian church, was now a Muslim house of worship. The building adapted, survived, endured. It was still the most famous landmark in Athens. Travelers from Europe visited and wrote about it. They called it the Temple of the Unknown God. Unsure whether it had been built by the ancient Greeks or the Romans, they sketched and measured it, and marveled at its size and beauty. In 1687, disaster struck. The Ottoman Empire was at war with the Republic of Venice. The Ottomans used the Parthenon as a gunpowder magazine, storing barrels of explosives inside the ancient temple. On September 26, a Venetian mortar shell, fired from a nearby hill, flew over the walls of the Acropolis and crashed through the roof of the Parthenon. The gunpowder ignited. The resulting explosion tore the building apart. The roof was blown off. The interior was shattered. The columns on the sides collapsed. The sculptures were blasted into fragments. The Parthenon, which had survived 2,000 years of weather and religious change, was reduced to a ruin in a single, fiery moment. The explosion killed hundreds of people. The Acropolis was filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. The Venetians briefly occupied the ruins, then withdrew. The Parthenon was left as a hollow shell, open to the sky. The next great trauma in the history of the Parthenon came at the beginning of the 19th century. Lord Elgin, a British aristocrat and diplomat, was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He obtained a controversial permit from the Ottoman authorities to remove sculptures from the Acropolis. The exact wording of the permit is still debated. Elgin interpreted it as a license to take whatever he wanted. Between 1801 and 1812, his agents systematically stripped the Parthenon of a large portion of its surviving sculptures. They sawed sections off the frieze. They pried metopes from the walls. They removed figures from the pediments. They packed the pieces in crates and shipped them to England. The operation was brutal. Many of the sculptures were damaged in the removal. Some were smashed in transit. The British public was divided. Some saw Elgin as a savior of ancient art. Others, including the poet Lord Byron, condemned him as a vandal and a thief. Byron wrote a scathing poem denouncing Elgin's actions. He called him a cultural pirate. The debate over the Elgin marbles has never been resolved. They remain in the British Museum to this day. Greece has been demanding their return for decades. The argument is simple. The marbles were taken without the consent of the Greek people, who were at the time under Ottoman occupation. They are an integral part of a monument that stands on Greek soil. They belong in Athens. The British Museum argues that they were legally acquired, that they are better preserved in London, and that they are now part of a World Heritage Collection accessible to millions of visitors. The dispute is a bitter, emotional, and unresolved chapter in the long story of the Parthenon. 840940. Part 10. The Modern Parthenon Restoration and Memory. Today, the Parthenon is a building site. Cranes and scaffolding surround the ancient columns. A massive restoration project, begun in the 1970s and still ongoing, is slowly, painstakingly repairing the damage of centuries. The restorers use the same Pentelic marble, quarried from the same mountain as the original, but their methods are modern. Laser cleaning, titanium reinforcements, computer modeling. Each block is studied, cataloged, and returned to its correct position. The goal is not to rebuild the Parthenon completely, but to stabilize it, to correct the mistakes of earlier restorations, and to preserve it for future generations. The restoration of the Parthenon is a statement. It says that this building matters, that the values it represents, democracy, reason, artistic excellence, civic pride, are still worth preserving. The Parthenon is not just a Greek monument, it is a human monument. It belongs to the world, and the world has a stake in its survival. But the Parthenon is also a reminder that empires fall, that religions change, that even the most magnificent buildings can be destroyed in a moment of violence or neglect. The Parthenon has been a pagan temple, a Christian church, a Muslim mosque, a gunpowder magazine, a tourist attraction, and an archaeological site. It has been burned, exploded, looted, and restored. It has seen the rise and fall of Athens, of Rome, of Byzantium, of the Ottoman Empire. It has witnessed democracy, tyranny, and peace. It has stood on that hill for 2,500 years, and it will stand for centuries more. The Parthenon is a survivor, and its survival is a kind of miracle. So, what really happened inside the Parthenon? The answer is layers upon layers of history. Sacrifices and prayers, gold and ivory, priests and politicians, virgins weaving sacred cloth, soldiers counting the spoils of Christians praying to the Virgin Mary, Muslims bowing towards Mecca, Ottoman soldiers stacking barrels of gunpowder, Venetian shells arcing through the sky. British agents sawing sculptures off the walls, modern restorers piecing the stones back together. The Parthenon is a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten over centuries. To ask what happened inside it is to ask what happened inside Western civilization. The Parthenon is a mirror. It reflects who we were, who we are, and who we might become. Next time you see an image of it, or stand before it in person, remember the stories I have told you today. Remember the goddess who is also a bank vault. Remember the procession that fed the poor. Remember the explosion that tore the roof off. Remember the hands that carved the marble and the hands that stole it. The Parthenon is not silent. It speaks, and if you listen closely, you can hear it. The whisper of prayers, the clash of swords, the roar of flames, the quiet, patient work of restoration. The Parthenon remembers everything. And now, so do you. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, you have journeyed through 2,500 years of history. Leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. Like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves history. I will see you in the next one.